Hey, welcome back. You might want to hold on to your hats because this escalated rapidly. I was having such a good time building this truck that I just didn't stop. So I completely assembled it. Chassis anyway. Body next week. But for those that were wondering, there is my badass dog that came with mine, my free gift. So I have a new one to go with my two other, what were they? St. Bernards. Yeah, St. Bernards. Anyway, on to the video. So, there it is. Assembled. I didn't put a receiver and electronics in it yet. Well, I got servos in it, but I don't have power in it yet. But there is the Series 2 88 in all its glory. Smooth as silk. Loving the new tires. They look pretty cool. So it is fantastic. Fantastico. It went together smooth, no issues. This video is pretty much an overview of how I got there, and I'm going to fill you in on some tips and tricks of building these chassis so you don't make mistakes and have to do a bunch of rework. One of the cool things that were included in this were the addition of screws that go into these bosses. I didn't notice them on the other kits, and if I missed them, I'm sorry, Jason, at BoomRacing, but they give you 4 self-tappers to go in through the chassis sides to get into these molded parts, and it really stiffens them up. So gone are the days of catching a tree branch up underneath of this thing, sticking up through here and pulling down on these screws. So that'll definitely help that. It'll just stop the truck instead of creating problems and damage and whatnots. I'm going to try and go through the manual. I'll put that back up here. Oh, for running gear. This is the ESC mount. If you're not familiar, the ESC can go right up here. For the electronics, I think in this one I have a Micro X that I have sitting around that's already set up for brushed. So that's going to go right there. And it is the perfect size for that micro speed control. Plenty of distance from the motor. Keeps everything under the hood easily accessible. Love it, and that's what I'm going to use on this truck. And I will use a BEC. I use the Castle 2.0s and a servo direct connect with this. So I can run my receiver off of my ESC, and I can run my servos off of the BEC to give them all the voltage, all the amps that they could ever want. But that's my plan. I'll probably get to that tomorrow. But what I wanted to go over, let's see if I can get the glare off of that. Still see it. It shouldn't be too bad right there. But the owner's manual for this one is slightly different. We have the addition of the Recon G6 logo. If you didn't know, this is the official scale performance chassis of the Recon G6, which is the BRX02 line. So, going through the manual, no real surprises in here. Tells you how to identify your number plates and all the tools you'll need, all the parts listings with all the part numbers. So use this as your reference. Don't throw away your manual. If you need something, it's easier to go to the manual and type in the part number than it is to try and find other stuff on websites. But anyway, so going through, one thing I didn't write on here, but make sure you're orienting your shock towers the correct way. They should definitely overhang the chassis so you can put the shock on If you put them on backwards, they'll be inboard and you won't be able to put your shock on later. Not a big deal. Should be able to pick up the reference from the pictures pretty easily on this. Transmission, there's these two little circles in the face of the transmission that you can use, and it tells you up here to install, remove spur gear, put two M3 screws in these two little bosses. There's little divots in 4 places on this spur gear, and that'll lock the spur gear in so you can actually tighten these screws. Very helpful. On the transfer case, the shims, and I've circled most of the things that I want to kind of talk about here. These shims, be very conscious of where these shims go and what sizes they are. You'll see through the transmission it calls out these shims, and then there's different shims, like this is a 0.1 and this is a 0.5. Calls it a spacer. It's a shim, but they're critical to the transmission working flawlessly. This little one over here, you'll notice an oddball in your bag, and it's because it's a different diameter. This is a 7. The rest of them are 8s, so it'll look smaller, but it's also a 0.5. When you put this guiding shaft in, which is actually right here, this guiding shaft is this piece here, and when you put it in, this spacer and this bearing ride right on the end of this. So why this is important, so the way this transmission is designed, you'll pull this back out to connect the transmission and the transfer case, which is noted here. So keeping this, do what the picture says. Like, it's that easy. Lay this on its face, pull that guide out, then put your transmission in. Spin the spur gear and make sure that this engages the gear that's inside of that transfer case. And then leave it in that orientation until you're ready to install it into the chassis. The reason I bring this up, I've done a couple of these 88s now, and what I'm telling you here on this page is this isn't a tightening sequence or anything. This is just order of assembly that'll make your life a lot easier. Start these 2 screws first into the transfer case. Then start the screws for the transmission that go up here. If you do it in that order, you're least likely to have this slide out of the transmission and that shim fall down inside of the transfer case, which will keep you from having to open the transfer case and dig that shim out. If this comes off at any time before you put all of this into the chassis at the same time, you're going to want to pull this apart because there's going to be a shim floating around in there. So just be aware of that. This isn't an assembly order or a torque sequence or anything like that. All these holes will line up exactly. But I'm just saying, start these 2 first, then start these, and then go back and tighten them all up. And it just makes your life a lot easier. So it's kind of like the big one. The next big one is with the leaf springs. I've already answered a couple questions on the old face page about the leaf springs and how to set them up. When the leaf springs are given to you, they look like this. Now mine, these lock bolts were about halfway up the threads, which I do appreciate because I don't have to unthread all of that. But you're going to reuse all this hardware. But the spring plate, you're going to flip around if you go with the main leaf and the A leaf as suggested. This is the suggested setup for a stock truck that's not running anything but the stock body, no extra hoo-ha or decor weight on the truck. So if you add a winch or you add something else to the front bumper that's heavy, you're going to want to go a little bit to the heavier settings in this chart. But what I'm explaining to you is, don't forget you have to clock the 10 degrees in. This will keep you from your tie rod connecting or interfering with your leaf springs. Do this 10 degrees. You need it. Don't think you don't. You do. You need that 10 degrees. So each slot on that axle is 10 degrees. So you're just going to move it one tooth, and that'll be your 10 degrees. And this is, look at the pictures, read the whole page, absorb what's going on in here. This little plate gets flipped over from what's given to you. You have to flip that over when you remove leaves, and then those bolts go up through. There's two brackets that go on the top, and then the nuts. These screws going into these nuts, it will not reach the lock part of the lock nut. No matter, you're not doing anything wrong, it's just the way it is. These are M3x20s. If they were M3x23, they would probably go through that lock nut. M25 is too long in this position, so M20 it is. Just put a dab of thread lock on top of those screws once they're up through, and then put your lock nuts on. I've done it without putting any Loctite on these, and I've never lost one. And I run my trucks, I've never lost those nuts. I watched the guy do it at the Recon G6. He ran the crap out of his truck. Those nuts were still on there when I changed his leaf packs out. So he didn't Loctite those either. So I'm just saying, Loctite is your friend, but you definitely, if you want your peace of mind, just put a little dab of Loctite on those screws when you run them through, and you'll be golden. Again, on the back, this is the rear axle, same thing. Pay attention to flipping this bracket over, and this is the main and the B leaf for the rear end, and it holds up fine. My 109, I have this same spring setup with the Scale Garage Systems rack on the back of it, and it's a little too soft once the leaves broke in, so I'm definitely going to have to go back and add another leaf to that truck, and it takes time to run the leaves in, so you got to do that. Nothing here, pretty straightforward. Putting these shocks together. Again, read the page in its entirety. There's little divots on the top and the bottom collets where you're going to push these plastic pieces in using the tool that they give you. This tool works great. You may jump right to these and try and snap the ball in. Don't do it. I'm telling you now, don't do it. This hole in here in this tool is too big, and it will push out the plastic, and you're going to regret it. There's only 2 spares, so you only get to screw up 2 of them. Use the tool. It works flawlessly. But make sure you're putting your plastic spacer in the side on the shock that has the little divot. It's very obvious when you're looking for it. You'll see it right away. You'll be like, oh, there it is. Jeremy was right. But that plastic piece goes in on the retainer side. Pivot ball comes in from the other side. It'll keep your shocks happy, and you won't push those plastic pieces out in your first couple runs. Let's see, what else did we have in here? Oh, there's those screws I was talking about. Those self-tappers that are going through the sides into the bottom plates. Oh, okay. So, setting the gear mesh. Alright, there's a couple motors that I'm going to tell you from experience absolutely require this plate, and motors that don't. Brushless motors typically do not need that plate, and I've done The Spectrum systems, the Hobby Wing systems, the 2-in-1s, they don't use this plate. Castle motors do not use this plate. Watch your screw lengths going into motors. They do give you these, but some motors do not like an 8 mil. They want a 6 mil. Listen to your motor when you're putting these screws in. Make sure your motor spins after you put those screws in by hand, not by power. You could have a bad day. Motor shaft lengths. I can tell you now, the Holmes motors are very proud when you push this pinion down and it bottoms out. There's a little nub that'll stick out on the Holmes motors. You'll have to cut that off if you want to use a 550 can Holmes, like Trailmaster or something along those lines. Because what that motor nub does is it will go through and it'll rub on the spur gear inside the transmission, and you'll have a bad day. It'll actually lathe out that ring gear, the sun gear, off of the spur gear if you leave that little nub on. So don't do that. The 9-tooth that they give you, pinion gear, is the absolute smallest you can go. If you do run a 550 can that has, or a can that has that magnet, let's see if I can find one here. If you run one with the external magnet retainer, you'll know what I'm talking about when you see it here. If it has this ring, this reluctor ring, or whatever they want to call it, this little magnet improver, if it has that ring on it, you're going to want to run a 10-tooth, because the servo, it'll put the servo like within a hair of the motor. You really don't want that kind of magnet right against a servo. It's not good for the servo at all, especially a magnetic centering servo. So if you have the 10-tooth, you'll have about that much distance. You'll have about a, I don't know, 2 mil distance between your motor and the servo, which is enough to keep from screwing with a servo. Just keep that in mind. If you want to go up to an 11, go to an 11. Give yourself a little safety net. But that's with these high magnet rings. What I like to do after I install the motor onto the transmission is I just use a double A, brushed motors obviously, just run a AA battery, and make sure you're still in frame here. I just put and just run the battery, run the motor. That's enough to run the transmission. Just a single AA, it's 1.5 volts. Make sure your drive line is spinning. Make sure your transmission shifts by hand. You can just pull the shifter in and out. Terrible, put my hand in front. You can pull the shifter in and out and run it through the 2 gears, running off of a single AA battery. Everything should turn nice and smooth and be fairly quiet. So there's that tip of the day. Next tip, and following the pages here. So I'm going from page 39, page 40, page 41. If you're going to use this ESC plate that's up here, put it on before you put the motor in. This is the 3rd truck I've done where I forgot to put the ESC mount on before the motor, and I had to take the motor back off to put the ESC plate on because I love these plates. I don't know why, but I love putting the speed control up here because it makes so much more sense than trying to jam it in somewhere else. I don't run all-in-ones generally because the lengths, and they're not Castle, and I'm a Castle guy or a brush guy, so whatever. Anywho, the wire retainer clips. This might be news to somebody. Other people will be like, duh. But on the sheet, they give you short, mediums, and longs. Longs are for wires that are large. And, you know, like if you're running motor wires all the way back through here, along with a battery wire to get back here, you might want to use a long strap on here to get that much wire held down. don't try and use a short strap because they'll just rip. And then, you know, you only get so many of each one before you gotta buy them all. So use the one that's appropriate, that's easy and screws down without pulling or stretching these bands. That's what I'm trying to say here. Just, there's multiple lengths. Just use them. I think that might be about all my notes. Yeah, I think that's all my notes. I did pull apart the pinion gear piece, the chunk, third member, whatever you want to call it. I did pull them off and check for grease. There are grease in these axles that are very adequate. They're well done. I don't really have any reason to pull them apart. I love my cow lube, but if the manufacturer gives it to me and it's lubed correctly, I'm not going to replace it until I do maintenance down the line sometime in the future. And I typically use udder butter to do that. Same with their Loctites. I use the blue on most of the screws. Any of the smaller screws, I'll use the wicking green or the light purple, and go from there. So those are my tips. Those are my tricks. Wheels went together. I love these new bolts. The scale bolts that go in here are fantastic. They're long enough. You don't need any extra. You don't need the long bolts to run through to center things up. When you get them, they're bolted together, the wheel. And if you're paying attention, when you take these 5 bolts out, leave that when that last bolt's in there, grab yourself a little Sharpie and put a little dot beside the lug bolt, loosen it up, and then make a little dot on the back side of the wheel. And that'll make sure you line up your slots so you can see straight through the wheel. You probably can't see it on here, but they're clocked. So putting them back together again, once they've been in 2 pieces, you're like trying to spin them around and try and find where their happy place is and line these up. It only goes one way. There's 9 combinations to get it wrong, but it only goes one way. I just use my Sharpie and just put dots on it before I take them completely apart. That way I can line them up and clock them, and they just go together, and the scale bolts go right in. No muss, no fuss. So those are my tricks. Let's see what I got left over here in bags. I got my receiver box yet to put together. Got my servo horns to put on once I'm centered. Got my body mounts and my others bag and my shift lever. So I got those few things to do when I center all my electronics and center all my servos and set all my endpoints. This little pile over here is basically the screws and stuff that I have left. Ask me how I know about smashing one of the plastic rings with that tool. I did it. It's right there. It pushed it right out. So I have 1 spare. But yeah, there it is. The body, hopefully I'll get to it this week if all goes well. And I will be able to have a finished truck by this time next week. That's my goal. It's my hope, my plan. If you're going to use the Reefs Micro 55, it's the same size servo horn as the JX servo that Boom gives you, which is a fine servo. I'm a Reefs guy, so I like the Reefs 55. I can run the higher voltage through here. It is a waterproof 7-seal submersible servo because I do play in the water, but it's a little loose in these brackets. So I just use a little bit of sticky back foam and line the bracket top and bottom with that sticky back. It goes in there. It is maybe, let's see if we can see it in there. It is so thin. You can see how thin it is going across here, and that's just on the inside of this bracket. I got it at Hobby Lobby or something like that. It's just self-stick foam. I don't know where it's at, but that's all it is. But that'll get you there, and that'll keep that servo from moving around. Even if it does move around, it's not going to go. It's not going to fall out. Use what you want. It'll go right in. But that's about it. I don't think I have any other things to offer you on the build so far. So if you're building along, enjoy. It's a wonderful build. It's a wonderful chassis. Huge shout out to Jason Sang and those guys. Well done. Just well done. Until then, until the body's done and we come back again, I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching. Thanks for subscribing. I appreciate you. And there is an affiliate link in the description down there below. So if you enjoy the video, click on another one. There will be one up here, subscribe, something around here. Anyway, enjoy. Thanks.